Chapter 1. The Unlikely Critique. Miss Marple sat in the comfortably worn armchair by the fire, a well-worn knitting basket at her side. The late afternoon light filtered through the curtains of the drawing-room, casting a warm golden glow over the familiar furnishings of her nephew's home. The house, though more modern than Miss Marple was accustomed to, had a certain charm, a sense of quiet comfort that reminded her of St. Mary Mead. It was an agreeable place, the kind of house that welcomed visitors with a soft embrace, the kind where people felt they could speak freely without fear of being judged. Her nephew, Raymond, a man of about 30, rather slim and with an air of perpetual preoccupation, stood in front of her, excitedly waving his small manuscript in his hands. His rather pale face was flushed with the excitement of an author who had just received the best news of his career. "Aunt Jane, I'm so glad you're here. I wanted to share something with you," he exclaimed, the eagerness in his voice unmistakable. "My book, it's going to be published. It's official now." Miss Marple glanced up at him over her spectacles, her sharp eyes hidden behind the faded lenses, taking in the sight of her nephew's enthusiasm. Raymond had always been a man of great ideas and occasionally great ambitions. He had always spoken of writing as a calling, and she had often wondered what exactly it was that drove him to it. She shifted slightly in her chair, the knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she began another row of her rather unremarkable sweater. She could have given him a response filled with genuine enthusiasm, but Miss Marple was not the sort to mince words or pretend an interest she didn't feel. "That's very good, Raymond," she said, in her usual no-nonsense way, "though I must admit I don't recall reading anything of yours that I would call particularly memorable." Raymond's expression faltered for just a moment. He wasn't used to such blunt assessments, least of all from his elderly aunt, who, while kind and affectionate in her own way, had never been one to indulge in pleasantries. He hesitated, but only for a moment. "What do you mean, Aunt Jane?" he asked, though the slight crease between his brows suggested he already knew the answer. "You did read my short stories a few years ago, didn't you?" "Yes, I did," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but firm. She placed the knitting down carefully beside her and folded her hands in her lap. "But I must confess, Raymond, those stories of yours, well, I found them to be rather lacking." Raymond blinked, clearly taken aback by his aunt's candor. He had imagined that Miss Marple, being elderly and perhaps a little out of touch with modern literature, would have been more polite about it. After all, she was a woman of great taste and sharp judgment. But this was unexpected. "They were quite dreadful, actually," Miss Marple continued, her voice not unkind but direct. "Full of overblown melodrama and characters so one-dimensional that they hardly seemed worth the paper they were printed on." There was a pause as Raymond stared at her, unsure of how to respond. The words stung, but he knew somewhere deep down that she was right. He had always sought her approval, but perhaps, in truth, he had not written the kind of stories that would earn it. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but one that he knew was necessary. "Well," Raymond said after a moment, trying to regain some composure, "I thought they had potential. I've been told by others that my writing is unique." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'm just a bit worried about how people might react when they read the book, you know. It's hard to know what's good and what's not sometimes." Miss Marple gave him a small smile, her eyes twinkling behind the glasses. "If you want my advice, Raymond, you should stop writing stories altogether. I believe you'd do better as a teacher, somewhere where you could help young minds learn about the world, rather than trying to make a career out of writing. Perhaps a good school in the countryside, somewhere that needs a man with your skills. Raymond looked at her, utterly stunned. You think I should give up on writing? But Aunt Jane, this is what I've always wanted, to be a published author, to see my name in print. It's a dream come true. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Dreams can often be deceiving, Raymond. I've read enough of your stories to know that writing might not be your true calling, but teaching, I think you do quite well as a teacher. You have a certain way with people, even if it's not the sort of way that makes one the great storyteller. Raymond opened his mouth to protest, but was interrupted by the sound of footsteps from the hallway. His wife, Mabel, a petite woman, with an air of gentle sweetness, entered the room with a tray of tea. She set it down on the low table and smiled at Miss Marple before turning her attention to her husband. Raymond, darling, you're still talking about your book? Mabel asked, in a tone that was almost too placating, as though she were trying to smooth over the tension in the room. Oh, Mabel, Aunt Jane just told me I should stop writing altogether, Raymond said, a hint of frustration in his voice. She thinks I'd make a better teacher than an author. Mabel's eyebrows shot up, though she quickly masked her surprise with a smile. Well, Aunt Jane is probably right, she said diplomatically. Writing stories is not exactly your forte, dear. You've never had a knack for it. But perhaps teaching is something you could do well. After all, you're so good with people. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea and studied the couple over the rim of her cup. Indeed, perhaps Raymond might even make an excellent teacher, she said thoughtfully. But for the moment, let's put that aside, shall we? I understand you're planning to go to the cinema this evening. Raymond, eager to change the subject, brightened immediately. Yes, we're going to see a movie. It's a new film featuring that famous actor, Adrian Blake. You've heard of him, haven't you? He's a friend of mine, you know. Miss Marple nodded, her interest piqued. Adrian Blake, you say? Yes, I've heard of him. A very talented fellow, though rather too much of a ladies' man, I dare say. Well, he's not like that with me, Raymond said with a laugh, his previous irritation forgotten in the excitement of the evening ahead. He's a good friend, and it's always a bit of a treat to see him on the big screen. Mabel's eyes sparkled with excitement. I'm so looking forward to it. It will be such a nice change of pace. Miss Marple smiled knowingly. Very well. If you'll excuse me, I think I'll retire to my room for a rest before you head out. But do enjoy the movie, Raymond. And remember, sometimes it's not the dream you have, but the practical skill that brings the most satisfaction in life. With that, Miss Marple rose from her chair, leaving Raymond and Mabel to their preparations for the evening. As she made her way up the stairs, her thoughts were already turning to more pressing matters, as they always did. Yet, somewhere in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but wonder if Raymond's book would ever find its rightful place, whether in the hands of readers or in the quiet confines of a desk drawer, where it truly belonged. But that, as Miss Marple would say, was a matter for another time. Chapter 2. An Invitation to Intrigue. The sun had just begun its slow descent behind the horizon, casting a golden glow over the comfortable drawing room of Miss Marple's nephew, Raymond. The house was quiet, as it often was in the late afternoon, save for the soft tick-tock of the grandfather clock and the occasional clink of china cups as tea was poured. Miss Marple, who had never been one for idle chatter, sat comfortably in her armchair by the fire, a light shawl draped over her shoulders. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically as she worked on the same project she had been fussing over for days, a rather uninspiring sweater in dull shades of gray and beige. But to Miss Marple, the act of knitting was as much about thinking as it was about crafting. Raymond, having finished his cup of tea, leaned forward in his chair, his face aglow with enthusiasm. He had been eager to share his excitement all day. The movie they had watched together the night before had stirred something in him, and he was bursting to tell Miss Marple all about it. "Aunt Jane," he said almost breathlessly, "I do believe that movie had the most superb story I've ever come across. It was truly remarkable. The plot was so well crafted, so clever in its execution, and the twists, oh, Aunt Jane, they kept me on the edge of my seat." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing Raymond as he spoke, placed her knitting down and adjusted her spectacles. She took a moment to consider her nephew's words, the weight of his excitement evident in his tone. It wasn't often that Raymond, who usually spoke of his own literary aspirations with such fervor, showed genuine appreciation for another's work. This movie had clearly struck a chord with him, and Miss Marple, who had seen and heard much in her long life, couldn't help but admire his passion. "Yes, I must admit," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The story was indeed quite good. There was a certain finesse to it, a way of keeping the audience captivated without resorting to unnecessary spectacle. It's not easy to create such an effect, you know." Raymond's eyes brightened at her approval. "You really think so?" he asked, his enthusiasm growing. "I've always believed that a good story is built on tension and character, not just action and drama. The characters were so well developed and the plot unfolded so naturally, no forced turns. It was absolutely brilliant." Miss Marple smiled gently, not one to easily dole out praise, but she could not deny that the movie had, in its own way, been quite engaging. "I do think you're right, Raymond. It's a rare thing to see such a careful balance." The conversation was momentarily paused by the sound of a soft knock on the door. Mabel, Raymond's wife, entered the room with a pleasant smile on her face. She was a woman of gentle disposition, whose calming presence could smooth over any argument or uncomfortable silence. "Raymond, Aunt Jane," she said, "I just wanted to let you know that there's a phone call for you, Raymond. It's about that actor you mentioned yesterday, Adrian Blake, I believe." Raymond, who had been lost in thought, immediately perked up. "Adrian Blake, of course, I'd completely forgotten. Thank you, Mabel." He quickly rose and excused himself from the room, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. She couldn't help but find it curious how quickly Raymond's attention had shifted from his literary aspirations to the subject of the actor. It wasn't often that he was so easily distracted from a subject he felt passionately about. As Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts wandered back to the movie. It had been engaging, yes, but also a touch predictable. There was something too perfect about the plot, too smooth a resolution for her taste. But, as always, she didn't share her thoughts with Raymond, whose heart was now set on more immediate matters. Not long after Raymond returned, his face alight with excitement. "Aunt Jane, Mabel," he said, addressing them both, "I have wonderful news. Adrian Blake has invited us to a party at his house tomorrow evening to celebrate the success of the movie. He's quite keen to share the joy with his friends and colleagues, and he specifically asked for us to be there." Miss Marple regarded him with mild interest. "How nice. I've heard of Mr. Blake, of course. Quite a famous actor, isn't he?" Raymond nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, exactly, and what's more, he's been most gracious in extending this invitation. He said that he's been meaning to host a celebration, and now that the film is a success, he's eager to thank those who've supported him along the way. He's invited us all, Mabel, you, Aunt Jane. It should be quite an affair." Miss Marple glanced at her nephew and, after a moment's consideration, nodded. "Well, I suppose it could be a nice change of pace. It's not every day that one is invited to the home of a famous actor. But," she added, her voice tinged with the faintest smile, I won't be attending to be swept up in the glamour of it all. I shall go purely as an observer, of course." Raymond chuckled. "Of course, Aunt Jane, you wouldn't have it any other way, but I do think you'll enjoy it. Adrian is a remarkably down-to-earth fellow despite his fame." The following evening, Miss Marple found herself once again in Raymond's car, being driven to the estate of Adrian Blake. The journey was brief, though the roads seemed unfamiliar, winding through areas Miss Marple did not often frequent. As they approached the actor's home, it became apparent that Raymond's description had not been exaggerated. The house was magnificent, an imposing structure nestled among manicured gardens and surrounded by large gates that gave it the air of a secluded retreat. It stood as a testament to the success of its owner. When they arrived at the front door, Adrian Blake was waiting, his tall figure silhouetted against the interior lights. His welcoming smile was as warm and genuine as ever. "Raymond, Mabel, Aunt Jane," he greeted them, his voice filled with genuine pleasure. "I'm so glad you could make it. We've been waiting for you." Adrian led them inside, and Miss Marple could not help but feel a twinge of intrigue. The house was every bit as grand as the exterior, with high ceilings, plush furniture, and walls adorned with paintings of famous landscapes. There was an air of sophistication about the place, but it was not overdone. There was a quiet luxury in the details, the gleaming chandeliers, the delicate porcelain figurines displayed on pedestals, the rich carpets underfoot. It was the sort of home that exuded success, but not ostentation. As Adrian led them further inside, Miss Marple took a moment to observe her surroundings. The party was in full swing, with guests chatting amiably and drinks being served by impeccably dressed servants. Yet as always, Miss Marple's keen eye took in more than the surface of things. There was something about this gathering, something that didn't quite sit right. But for now she kept her thoughts to herself. She was, after all, here to observe. And in her experience, the truth was often hidden beneath layers of politeness and pleasantries. "I trust you'll enjoy the evening," Adrian said with a grin. "Please, make yourselves comfortable. We've all been looking forward to your company." Miss Marple, ever the observer, gave a small nod, her mind already turning over the subtle details of the evening. She had the distinct feeling that this party, despite its outward joviality, might lead her to something far more intriguing than a mere celebration. But for now she would wait and watch, as she always did. The mystery was just beginning. Chapter 3. A Night of Blood and Secrets. The evening had passed in a pleasant blur of soft conversation and laughter, the type of evening where the world outside seemed to fade away, and only the warmth of the dining room, filled with good food and good company, seemed to matter. The guests at Adrian Blake's estate had gathered in the grand dining room, the long mahogany table glistening under the soft golden light of the chandeliers above. The silver and crystal gleamed as the servants bustled in and out, refilling glasses and replenishing dishes, their movements so seamless they might as well have been part of the room's very decor. Adrian Blake, ever the charming host, took it upon himself to introduce his guests in a manner befitting someone of his fame. With a sweeping gesture, he introduced his wife, Catherine, a woman of striking beauty and composure, whose every move seemed calculated for maximum effect. Next, he turned to his daughter, a young woman with a demure presence that contrasted sharply with her father's larger-than-life persona. She was polite, quiet, and watched the proceedings from a distance, her eyes often flicking toward her father, as though expecting something from him, perhaps approval, perhaps something more. The introductions continued as Adrian moved on to his co-star, a well-known actress in her own right, whom Adrian had worked with on several of his most successful films. Her beauty was striking, yet there was something distant about her. A certain froideur in her smile, a coldness in her eyes, as if she were a woman who had learned to hide her emotions beneath layers of carefully constructed charm. Finally, Adrian turned to the film director, a man of stern, calculating demeanor, whose unspoken authority seemed to radiate from his very presence. He sat slightly apart from the rest, his sharp eyes rarely meeting those of others for more than a second, always scanning the room, always assessing. Miss Marple, seated at one end of the table, observed them all quietly, her mind working as it always did, taking in the smallest details. There was a certain tension in the air, an unspoken dynamic between the actors and those associated with the film. Though the conversation was polite, Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that there were undercurrents, quiet, almost imperceptible, but present nonetheless. The actors' smiles were too polished, the pleasantries exchanged too rehearsed. Something in the way they looked at one another suggested that the world of glamour they inhabited was, in truth, far more fragile than it appeared. The meal, as expected, was a lavish affair, but it was the dessert that seemed to mark the turning point. The air had grown heavy with conversation about the success of Adrian's latest film, and it was clear that the actor was enjoying his moment in the limelight, basking in the admiration of his guests. His attention flitted from one person to another, but Miss Marple noticed how his gaze lingered just a little longer on his co-star than on the others. She also noticed the subtle way his wife, Catherine, seemed to draw her husband's attention back to her whenever his eyes wandered, as though silently reminding him of their relationship. The evening was drawing to a close, and Miss Marple, Raymond, and Mabel excused themselves to enjoy a last stroll through the beautiful garden. The estate was quiet and peaceful, the kind of place that seemed to welcome reflection, its neatly manicured lawns and rows of flowering shrubs offering a sanctuary from the bustle of the dinner inside. "Isn't it a lovely garden, Aunt Jane?" Raymond asked, his tone relaxed. "The entire estate has been impeccably maintained. I'm sure it must be quite a lot of work." "Yes, it's beautiful," Miss Marple replied, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings, always alert. "And I dare say it's a place where one might find a great deal of solace. Though—" She trailed off, a slight frown crossing her face as her thoughts turned inward. Raymond, sensing her distraction, gave her a puzzled look, but said nothing. Instead, the three of them continued to wander through the garden, admiring the tranquility of the surroundings. The last vestiges of sunlight were beginning to fade, and the evening air held the promise of a crisp, quiet night. After a few minutes, they returned to the gate, where the car was waiting to take them home. Just as Miss Marple was about to step into the car, a piercing scream shattered the calm. The sound was unmistakable, a woman's scream filled with terror and urgency. It echoed through the house, cutting through the night air with an intensity that left a chill in Miss Marple's bones. "Good heavens!" Mabel gasped, her face paling at the sound. "What was that?" Without waiting for a response, Miss Marple turned swiftly, her instincts already at work. "Stay here," she said, her voice calm, though her heart was racing. "I'll go inside and find out what's happened." Raymond and Mabel exchanged anxious glances but did not argue. They watched as Miss Marple made her way quickly back toward the house, her figure barely visible in the darkness. She moved with purpose, her keen mind already piecing together the potential causes for such a scream. But nothing prepared her for what she found when she entered the room. The door to Adrian Blake's private chambers was ajar, and Miss Marple pushed it open without hesitation. What she saw inside took her breath away. Adrian Blake, the star of the evening, the man who had played the role of the celebrated actor with such ease, was now lying motionless on the floor of his room. His eyes stared unseeing at the ceiling, his body sprawled in a way that seemed unnatural. A knife, dark and gleaming in the soft light of the room, was embedded deeply in his neck, blood pooling around him in a horrific display of violence. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, but her sharp mind remained focused. There was no sign of struggle, no obvious clues as to how the killer had gained access to the room. It was as though Adrian had been caught completely off guard, the violence done so swiftly that he had not even had time to react. The room was in disarray, items scattered across the floor as though the killer had ransacked the space. The window was open, the curtains fluttering slightly in the breeze, and Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the peculiar sight of the mirror. It had not gone unnoticed. On the glass, scrawled in what seemed to be lipstick or some other substance, was a single sentence. "I warned you." The words were chilling, each one etched in a way that suggested urgency, anger, and perhaps even fear. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, taking in the scene with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen too many crimes to be shocked anymore. Yet something about the message troubled her deeply. Before she could analyze further, Raymond and Mabel arrived at the doorway, their faces pale with shock. "What happened?" Raymond whispered, unable to tear his eyes away from the grim scene. "I'm afraid Mr. Blake has been murdered," Miss Marple said quietly, her tone calm despite the horror of the situation. Raymond's face drained of color. "Murdered," he repeated, his voice cracking. "But who? Who could have done this?" At that moment, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and within moments, the police arrived, their presence bringing a sense of urgency to the already tense atmosphere. The officers immediately took control of the scene, cordoning off the room and beginning their investigation. Miss Marple, ever the observer, remained at the edge of the room, watching carefully as the officers moved about. She noticed small details, the open window, the disarray of the room, the way the mirror reflected the scene in an eerie, distorted manner. There was a method to the madness, a careful precision that suggested the killer had known exactly what they were doing. The police were quick to start their work, but Miss Marple knew deep down that the answers would not come easily. The death of Adrian Blake was no random act of violence. It was deliberate, calculated, and as always, Miss Marple would follow the trail of clues, unraveling the mystery piece by piece until the truth was revealed. But for now, she would wait. The game had only just begun. Chapter 4. The questioning begins. The room where Adrian Blake's lifeless body lay was a scene of unsettling chaos. Miss Marple, her keen eyes never missing a detail, stepped carefully into the room, her gaze taking in the disarray with quiet precision. It was as if the place had been ransacked, though nothing appeared to have been stolen. Items lay scattered across the floor, books, papers, even clothing, all in a haphazard heap. The lamp, once perched on the side table, lay shattered in pieces. The shattered fragments of glass gleamed in the dim light, like so many tiny, glittering clues that Miss Marple knew would soon come together to tell a story. There was a curious stillness in the room, a silence that only heightened the unnaturalness of the scene. The air, heavy with the scent of blood, spoke of violence, of a struggle. Miss Marple's gaze was drawn to the body of Adrian Blake, whose features had already begun to stiffen in death. His eyes were wide open in shock, and his mouth hung slightly agape, as though frozen in the final moment of horror. A knife was embedded deeply in his neck, the blood surrounding him having soaked into the carpet beneath. It was clear to Miss Marple that there had been a struggle. The broken lamp, the disarray of the room, the knife's brutal placement in Adrian's neck. Each of these things told a part of the story. Adrian had fought, that much was obvious, but what had happened before and after? Miss Marple's mind raced as she continued her careful examination. She moved to the window, peering out into the darkness of the garden. The night air was still, the cool breeze rustling the trees outside. But Miss Marple's sharp gaze fell on the ground below the window, searching for any signs, footprints, a trail of disturbed earth. Nothing. The ground was undisturbed, as though no one had passed through recently. There was no sign of an escape or any indication that the murderer had fled in a hurry. The killer, Miss Marple surmised, had either entered or left by some other means, or perhaps had remained hidden in the house. Turning back toward the room, Miss Marple saw that the police had already begun to arrive. The officers, though competent, appeared flustered, their faces pale, as they took in the grim scene. It seemed to Miss Marple that the police were less certain of what to do than usual, as if the violent and abrupt nature of the murder had left them all somewhat unprepared. It wasn't long before they made the announcement that no one was to leave the house. The guests were gathered in the large hall, and Miss Marple followed them, taking note of each person's demeanor. She noticed how each individual seemed to react differently. Some looked pale and shocked, others nervous, but all were deeply concerned, trying to make sense of the tragedy. As the police officers began their inquiries, Miss Marple moved silently to the front, her voice steady as she asked, "Who saw the body first?" A servant stepped forward, her face a picture of distress. "I went to bring the mice for their room," she said, her voice trembling. "I knocked on the door, but it was locked. I called the wife, and we opened the door with the spare key, only to find the murder had occurred." Miss Marple listened intently, her mind quickly processing the information. "And when you entered, did you notice anything unusual? Did you see anyone coming or going from the room?" The servant shook her head, her eyes wide with confusion. "No, I didn't see anyone at all. It was completely quiet." She paused before adding, I didn't even hear a sound. It was as if the room had been still. And then I found him." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her thoughts already in motion. The servant's story, while tragic, didn't provide any new clues. No one had seen anyone leave the room, and there was no sign of a struggle in the hall. Still, Miss Marple knew that there was much to uncover. Turning her attention back to the group of gathered guests, Miss Marple began her investigation, starting with Adrian Blake's wife, Catherine. She approached the woman with a calm, disarming demeanor, sensing that she would be a crucial figure in this mystery. Catherine was standing at the edge of the group, her face pale and tight with suppressed emotion. Her eyes flickered to Miss Marple briefly before she looked away, her hands clasped nervously before her. Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Mrs. Blake," she said, her voice soft yet penetrating, "I couldn't help but notice during dinner that you and your husband seemed to be rather distant from each other." Catherine's eyes flickered, and Miss Marple saw a subtle change in her expression. Perhaps guilt, perhaps something else. "Yes," Catherine said, her voice tight. "You're absolutely right. We haven't been getting along very well lately." Miss Marple waited for her to continue, her gaze steady but patient. "Is that so? What could have caused such a rift between you two?" Catherine sighed, her shoulders drooping slightly as if the weight of the question was too much. I left my first husband because of money. I thought I could have a better life. I thought I could find happiness with Adrian. I married him for the same reason, money, but it didn't work out as I hoped. Adrian, he wasn't the man I thought he was." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "So you admit that your marriage was built on something other than love?" Catherine's expression grew even more strained. "Yes, I admit it. I married him for security, for wealth. But that doesn't mean I killed him. I didn't." Miss Marple, sensing the conflict in the woman's voice, pressed on. "Where were you when your husband was murdered?" "I was in the kitchen," Catherine replied quickly, almost too quickly. "I was preparing a snack for myself. I didn't know anything was wrong until the servant came to call me." Miss Marple studied her for a moment, the details of her story weighing on her. Something about Catherine's quickness to answer, the edge in her voice, made Miss Marple think she was hiding something more. But what? With a soft sigh, Miss Marple turned away and made her way to the next person, ready to continue her inquiry. She had learned long ago that even the smallest detail, the quietest word, could unlock a mystery. She knew that this case would be no different. The truth, as always, would come to light, and Miss Marple was prepared to wait for it, carefully examining each piece of the puzzle until it was complete. As the police began their own questions and took charge of the investigation, Miss Marple was already several steps ahead, piecing together the intricacies of the situation. This was no random act of violence. The murder of Adrian Blake was far more calculated than that, and Miss Marple, with her patient, methodical approach, would uncover the truth in time. Chapter 5. The Web of Motives. The evening's events had taken a decidedly grim turn, and Miss Marple's thoughts were already moving with the practiced precision of a seasoned investigator. There was something about the murder of Adrian Blake that nagged at her, a story beneath the surface, an unsaid truth that her sharp mind could almost feel, but had yet to fully uncover. As she stepped from one conversation to the next, she observed the various guests closely, weighing their words and actions. She knew that every person in that house was hiding something, and it was her task to unravel the mystery before the killer could escape into the shadows of doubt. Her stop was the co-star, a young woman whose beauty was only matched by the air of melancholy that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Miss Marple had noticed her earlier during the dinner, her eyes darting nervously whenever Adrian spoke of his wife or the success of his latest film. There was something unresolved in the way she looked at him, a kind of longing mixed with bitterness, which told Miss Marple that the actress had once been very close to Adrian. "Your love story with this actor was quite famous," Miss Marple began, her voice calm but probing. "But then the engagement broke off, and later the news reported that you two were getting close to each other again. Could it be that the actor refused to marry you and in a fit of anger you took his life?" The co-star stiffened at the question, her gaze flicking toward Miss Marple before dropping to the floor. "That's not the case at all," she replied sharply, though her voice trembled slightly. "We were indeed engaged, but then he married someone else. I was heartbroken, of course, but I moved on. I started focusing on my work, and that was that." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, taking in the co-star's words with the same quiet intensity. "I see," she said. "But what of the rumors that you were once again growing close to him? The press seemed to think you were rekindling your connection." The actress flushed and crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a tight line. "That's all they are, rumors, nothing more. Yes, we spoke, but that doesn't mean anything. I was focused on my career, and so was he." Miss Marple paused for a moment, then asked, "Where were you off to dinner?" The co-star's eyes darted to the side and she shifted her weight uneasily. "I was in the garden," she replied, her tone somewhat defensive. "I needed some fresh air. It had been a long evening and I just wanted to be alone for a while." Miss Marple made a mental note of the actress's words, but there was something in her response that still didn't sit quite right. She had evaded the question of their rekindled relationship with a sense of discomfort, and Miss Marple was certain there was more to the story than what the co-star was willing to admit. But there was little more she could press her on at the moment, and so she excused herself, turning her attention next to the film director. The director, a man of sharp features and an even sharper mind, had seemed aloof during the dinner, as though preoccupied with his own thoughts. His eyes were always calculating, constantly assessing the room, as if searching for something more than just conversation. Miss Marple had noticed his gaze linger on Adrian from time to time, but there was no obvious animosity between them. Yet, she was not one to take things at face value. It was rare to find a person in this business who didn't hide a few skeletons in the closet. "Mr. Hendricks," Miss Marple began, addressing the director in her characteristic way, "I've heard that all your previous movies were flops, and only this one has become a success. Given the financial struggles that often accompany such ventures, I imagine that the pressures have been great." The news also mentioned that Adrian Blake was quite an expensive actor, with hefty fees. Could it be that in your desperation, you killed him to solve your financial problems? The director's face paled slightly, though he quickly regained his composure. "It is true that I've had some financial difficulties recently," he admitted, his voice steady, though there was a certain hardness to his gaze. "But I assure you, Miss Marple, that Adrian and I were good friends. We had a professional relationship, yes, but it was one based on mutual respect. I would never—" Miss Marple raised a hand to cut him off, her eyes narrowing with an unspoken challenge. "And where were you when the murder occurred?" The director didn't hesitate for a moment. "I was sitting at the table here, reading the news," he said, his tone confident, almost too confident. "I didn't hear anything unusual, and I certainly didn't see anyone leave the room." Miss Marple studied the director's face, taking in every subtle twitch and every calculated word. He was being truthful, or at least seemed to believe he was. Yet there was something about the simplicity of his answer that bothered Miss Marple. His calm demeanor could easily be a mask, one that concealed a darker truth. It was a typical response from someone who was attempting to distance themselves from suspicion. Too clean, too rehearsed. As she moved away from the director, Miss Marple felt the weight of the situation settle more heavily on her shoulders. She had begun to piece together a picture of the relationship surrounding Adrian Blake, but that picture was still incomplete. Each person in this house had a motive, a possible reason for murder, but the truth still eluded her. Could it have been the actress, heartbroken, spurned, seeking revenge? Or the director, financially strapped, desperate to salvage his career? There was a cold, calculated air about the director, but his alibi was unshakable. Miss Marple had learned long ago not to rush to conclusions. Instead, she relied on careful observation, on the small inconsistencies in people's stories, the things they failed to mention, the things they couldn't quite hide. She had her suspicions, of course, but there was no need to reveal them prematurely. The truth would come in its own time. As she walked back toward the hall, she looked out of the corner of her eye at the other guests, each one seemingly absorbed in their own thoughts, yet all of them were tied together by one inescapable thread: the murder of Adrian Blake. Miss Marple knew that she was drawing closer to the answer. All she had to do was wait for the right moment to reveal the killer's identity. And when that moment came, she would be ready. Chapter 6. The Hidden Passage. The room was quiet as Miss Marple made her way toward the actor's daughter, who had been standing near the door, her posture stiff with discomfort. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted how the young woman shifted under her gaze, her expression a mixture of unease and suspicion. "You are your father's stepdaughter," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but deliberate. "And your mother left your father to marry this actor." The daughter, a young woman in her 20s with delicate features and an almost fragile air about her, stiffened at the mention of her family. Her eyes, dark and guarded, flickered for a moment before she answered. "Yes, I suppose that's true," she replied quietly, her voice betraying a hint of bitterness. "But I wasn't exactly consulted about it." She crossed her arms defensively. Miss Marple noticed a faint scar on the young woman's hand, a line that had been carelessly concealed beneath her sleeve. The mark looked recent, as if it had been made only a few days ago. Miss Marple's gaze lingered for a moment, sharp as ever, before she gently inquired, "How did you get this?" The daughter quickly lowered her hand, her cheeks flushing. "Oh, it's nothing," she said hastily, her tone a little too quick. "The cat scratched me. It happens sometimes." Miss Marple considered her words for a moment. "A cat scratch?" she asked, raising an eyebrow, though her voice remained gentle. "It looks a bit deeper than that." The young woman shifted uncomfortably, but after a moment, she simply nodded. "Yes, it's nothing," she repeated more firmly this time. Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued. The scratch didn't look like an ordinary cat mark, and the way the young woman had reacted suggested there was more to the story. But Miss Marple did not press further for the moment. There were many things to consider, and her mind was already piecing together the puzzle of the evening. "Where did you go after dinner?" Miss Marple asked next, her tone casual, but her sharp eyes never leaving the young woman's face. "I went to my room," the daughter replied, her voice suddenly cold, as if she were closing herself off from the conversation. "I needed some rest. It had been a long evening." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, making a mental note of the response. The young woman had no particular alibi to speak of, but there was something about her demeanor, something guarded and distant, that made Miss Marple suspect there was more to her actions that evening than she was willing to admit. After a moment's silence, Miss Marple excused herself and turned back toward the room where Adrian Blake's body had been found. She was drawn back to the scene, her mind circling over the various clues that had yet to fully reveal themselves. As she re-entered the room, she felt the familiar prickling sensation of something not quite right in the air. The room had been combed over by the police, but Miss Marple knew that the answers she sought were hidden beneath the surface. She moved slowly, carefully, inspecting every corner with the precision of a watchmaker examining an intricate timepiece. Her eyes lingered on the furniture, the scattered papers, and the position of objects that seemed to have been thrown about in haste. There was no sign of struggle beyond the body's placement, yet the disarray suggested a more calculated effort to hide something. Her gaze fell on the large, ornate mirror that hung on the far wall. Miss Marple had already noted its unusual presence in the room, but now, as she studied it more closely, something about it seemed off. "Mrs. Blake," Miss Marple called softly, turning to the actor's wife, who was standing near the door. The woman's face was pale, and her eyes still bore the lingering shock of the night's events. "Could you tell me about this mirror?" The wife glanced at the mirror and gave a small, distracted smile. "It's a very historical piece," she explained, her voice still tinged with the weariness of the evening. "It's been part of the house for centuries. We've always kept it here." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened as she looked at the glass. Something didn't sit right with her. The reflection seemed oddly distorted, almost as if the surface was not quite as flat as it should have been. She moved closer, inspecting the edges of the frame, running her fingers along the contours of the wood. There was a faint groove running around the edges, an imperceptible line that suggested the mirror could be moved, adjusted, or even removed. "May I?" Miss Marple asked politely, her voice soft as she reached for the frame. The wife nodded absently, clearly not understanding the significance of the question. With a gentle push, Miss Marple shifted the mirror aside, revealing something that made her heart quicken in her chest. Behind the mirror was a hidden passageway, dark and narrow, stretching back into the gloom of the walls beyond. The passage seemed to disappear into the shadows, its end lost in darkness. Miss Marple stood perfectly still for a moment, taking in the discovery. A secret passage. It was an unusual feature for a house like this, one that had been built with such grandeur, and yet it made perfect sense. A place to hide, to observe, without being seen. In the world of actors and directors where secrets and intrigues were commonplace, this hidden passage could have been the key to understanding the many hidden dynamics at play. Miss Marple felt a surge of excitement beneath her calm exterior. The discovery of the passage raised more questions than answers, but one thing was certain. The answer to Adrian Blake's murder was now within reach. Someone had been using this secret passage. Someone had been watching from the shadows, hidden from view. The question was, who? Turning to Mrs. Blake, Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering. "It seems there's more to this house than I first imagined," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I wonder who else knew about this hidden passage." The wife looked at the passage in shock, her hand instinctively going to her mouth. I didn't know it was here," she stammered. "It must have been from the time when the house was built, long before we moved in." Miss Marple studied her for a long moment, her sharp mind ticking over the possibilities. It was clear now that someone had used this hidden space, and it was equally clear that this secret was more than just a curious feature of an old house. This passage could very well be the key to understanding Adrian Blake's murder. The answers, Miss Marple knew, were hidden just beyond the shadows, and she would find them, if only she could follow the trail to its conclusion. Chapter 7. The Secret Behind the Mirror. The passage, narrow and dark, seemed to stretch endlessly before Miss Marple, the air heavy with the scent of dust and secrets long hidden. The walls, once ornate and grand, now stood in silent testimony to the passage of time, their very stillness belying the hidden stories they kept within. Miss Marple moved cautiously, her keen eyes scanning every detail, every inch of the space. Her footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoed faintly as she made her way down the passage. She had no doubt that this secret route had once been used for far more sinister purposes than merely moving unseen through the house. As she reached the end of the passage, her eyes caught sight of a door. It was slightly ajar, and from within she could hear the soft rustle of fabric. A faint light flickered from the crack beneath the door, casting long, eerie shadows in the otherwise dark corridor. With no hesitation, Miss Marple pushed the door open, her eyes immediately drawn to the room inside. It was a sparse, almost clinical space, no grand decoration or warmth here. The walls were plain, with only the barest touches of furniture to suggest its use. And then her eyes narrowed. There, in the corner of the room, she spotted what she had been looking for. The room was attached to the daughter's chamber, and Miss Marple's instinct told her that this space, though innocuous at first glance, held the key to solving the puzzle. She crossed the room quickly, and with a swift movement, she opened the wardrobe. Inside, Tucked carefully between a set of neatly folded clothes was a blood-soaked scarf. It was unmistakable, deep red, stained with the unmistakable evidence of a violent encounter. The fabric was frayed, suggesting it had been hastily discarded, perhaps in a rush. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she remained composed, her fingers tracing the edges of the scarf. This was no accident. The scarf, the blood, it all pointed to something far darker than what had been presented thus far. It was a crucial clue, one that linked the daughter more closely to the crime than anyone could have anticipated. Her gaze shifted to the floor, and there, lying near the wardrobe, was a pencil. It was ordinary enough at first glance, but as Miss Marple picked it up, the faint traces of red, perhaps lipstick or ink, on its tip caught her attention. A slow smile curled on her lips as understanding dawned. This was the same pencil used to write the threatening message on the mirror. It had been used with such haste, such urgency, that Miss Marple could almost hear the desperation in the stroke of the words. And then it all clicked into place. The mirror, the hidden passage, the blood-soaked scarf, the pencil. It was all connected, leading her back to the daughter. The young woman, trapped by the twisted expectations of her family, had been pushed too far. The marriage of her mother to Adrian Blake had been the final straw, the catalyst for a tragedy that had been building for years. Her jealousy, her frustration, had culminated in the brutal act of violence. Adrian Blake had to die, and she had been the one to make it happen. The message on the mirror, the final act of her rage, had been a cry for attention, a symbol of her betrayal, and her final, desperate attempt to be seen. She had done it, and in doing so she had unknowingly sealed her own fate. Miss Marple stood in the room, quietly absorbing the weight of the discovery. She now had the full picture. The pieces had fallen into place, and the truth was clear. She had solved the mystery. Chapter 8. The Unraveling of a Secret. The silence that fell over the room was thick with tension. Miss Marple, having carefully observed the various guests, stood at the center of the room with the collected calm that so often defined her. Around her, the group of individuals stood motionless, their eyes fixed on her, some with anticipation, others with growing unease. The murder of Adrian Blake had turned the evening's once light-hearted gathering into a macabre spectacle, and it was time for the truth to be revealed. Miss Marple raised her hand gently, signaling for everyone's attention. "I have figured out the secret of the mirror," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the palpable anxiety in the room. The guests stiffened. Some exchanged nervous glances while others took in her words with a mixture of curiosity and dread. "The mirror," Miss Marple continued, "is not what it appears. It is a two-way mirror. In other words, it was used for surveillance, an instrument for watching, without being seen." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "And behind this mirror, there is a hidden passage, a passage that leads directly to the daughter's room." The mention of the daughter brought a visible shift in the atmosphere. Her pale face flushed with a sudden rush of emotion, but she remained silent, her hands clutching her arms as though attempting to brace herself against the storm Miss Marple had unleashed. "The passage," Miss Marple went on, "has provided us with the crucial evidence we needed to understand what happened, evidence that links the crime directly to you, young lady." The daughter's breath caught in her throat, and for a brief moment, she seemed as if she might collapse under the weight of the accusation. But she straightened, attempting to gather whatever courage she had left, and stood defiantly before the gathering, Her eyes, filled with a mixture of defiance and something darker, met Miss Marple's steady gaze. "You've been watching me, haven't you?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but there was an unmistakable firmness to it. "Watching all of us. You knew what was happening, and you knew how to hide. The mirror's secret was never meant to be discovered, but I've uncovered it, just as I've uncovered the truth about the murder." Miss Marple turned toward the daughter, her gaze unwavering. "Tell us, why did you do it? Why did you kill Adrian Blake?" The young woman's face contorted for a moment, her lips trembling, as if she might burst into tears, but she quickly regained control. "I hated him," she said, her voice raw with emotion, though it carried a coldness that made the room shiver. "Because of him, my mother left my father. She abandoned him. And when she married him, it broke my father's heart. He couldn't cope. He turned to drugs to forget the pain. I saw it all happen. He was never the same after that. And then he died, alone and broken." The daughter's words came out in a rush, as if she had been bottling up years of rage and resentment. Her eyes blazed with a twisted sense of justification as she continued, her tone now laced with bitterness. "And Adrian Blake, he was the reason for all of it. If he hadn't come into our lives, my mother would still be with my father. If he hadn't come, maybe my father wouldn't have turned to those damnable drugs. If he hadn't come, my father would still be here." She took a shallow breath, her eyes widening, almost as though seeing the truth for the first time. "I wanted him to feel what I had felt. Pain. I wanted him to pay for what he did." Miss Marple watched the girl closely, noting the shift in her expression, the way her eyes darkened, the tightening of her jaw. It was not just sorrow that had driven this young woman to murder. It was something far deeper. The anger, the sense of abandonment, had festered into something much more dangerous, something that could no longer be contained. "I saw him," the daughter went on, her voice shaking but steadying as she spoke, "drinking alone in his room. He was drunk, as he often was, and that's when I saw my opportunity. I went through the passage, through the hidden door behind the mirror. I used it many times before, when I wanted to be alone, when I didn't want anyone to know where I was. I went straight to his room, and I killed him. I didn't even hesitate." Her words hung in the air, suffocating the room with their grim finality. The once innocent image of the daughter, the grieving young woman, crumbled away with every word that spilled from her lips. In its place was a confession, a cold, calculated admission of guilt. "And after I did it," she continued, almost too calmly, "I went back through the passage. I returned to my room as if nothing had happened, and I felt nothing. No remorse, no guilt, only relief." Miss Marple stood motionless, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed the confession. The daughter's voice had grown quieter now, as though she had finally expended all the emotion that had driven her. It was as if the confession had released something inside her, something that had been locked away for far too long. The room was still, the silence oppressive, until the sound of footsteps approaching broke it. The police, who had been quietly listening in the background, stepped forward and made them move. The officers, well-trained but still visibly shocked by the daughter's cold revelation, moved swiftly to arrest her. She offered no resistance, her eyes vacant, as though the act of murder had drained her of everything. As the police led her away, Miss Marple turned to the remaining guests, who stood in stunned silence. There were no words left to speak. Everything had been said, and the truth was now laid bare for all to see. The tension in the room slowly began to dissipate. though the shadows of what had transpired lingered in the air. Miss Marple, her task complete, gave a small, satisfied nod to herself. The mystery was solved, the murderer unmasked, and the secrets of the house finally revealed. It had taken time, patience, and a keen eye, but in the end, the truth had come to light. As Miss Marple turned to leave the room, she offered one last glance at the hidden passage. The house, though full of secrets, would now have to face the consequences of its dark past. And as for Miss Marple, she knew that the story would live on in her mind, as all the best mysteries did, long after the case was closed. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think it.